how many of you here love stories? I love them. And there has been a lot of research done in the past years over the way we use stories in our culture, what they mean to us, how they influence us. Did you know that over 65% of our conversations involve stories? And that's a lot. That's how we relate to people. That's how we share. It's through stories. And this is how we understand things. It's a very influential way to understand. And an example of this is, if we are given information in a bullet point form, only the language part of our brain is processing. But when we tell that same information through stories, every other part of our brain starts becoming activated and engaged, the experiential part of our brain. So stories are these experiences. If I were to tell you a story about camping in the woods, about the cool breeze wafting by, the rustle of leaves in the distance, or the waning warmth of the campfire, these images appeal to you. They might set off your own memories reflecting on those experiences. You can feel the little bit of a chill from that breeze. The sound of the leaves might make you think of, maybe there's a little animal running through the leaves nearby. What is that? And the waning warmth of the campfire might give you goosebumps. You hold yourself a little bit closer for that warmth. That's how effective stories are. And what's great about that is that's how we raise our children. We raise them on stories. From Noah's Ark to Jonah and the whale, the kids become engaged with these stories. They can place themselves in that narrative. Maybe they can see that expanse of water with no land in sight. They can hear the pitter-patter of the rain on the ark roof. They can smell the animals. It's engaging, and they learn about a God who saves those who are faithful. They are engaged on every level of their being. And if you notice how Jesus often taught, he taught in parables, more stories, because we can place ourselves in these stories. For instance, the parable of the lost sheep. This probably resonated with many shepherds. Their own memories of their own sheep going off, being lost, their journey of trying to save their sheep. They understand what Jesus is talking about because he's talking to them in stories. Now, there's many elements to stories, but there's three specific ones that I want to talk about. There's the invitation, the sharing, and the response. In the invitation, we are inviting someone to hear this story. This can be through the words of once upon a time, or as in Genesis, it's in the beginning. Come and hear. I have a story to tell you. We are being invited on a new adventure, for a new experience, to learn something, to experience as others have experienced. And then there's the sharing of the story. The speaker is sharing their life, their hardships, their struggles, the perseverance, the faith, the hope. And those who are listening can resonate on each of these levels. They can think, I remember when I had to persevere like that. I remember when I needed hope like that. Tell me more of your story so I can learn. Maybe the way you had faith can be the way I had faith. And that's then the response. We hear these stories, and we can either shrug them off as if they have no meaning for us, or we can let them internalize in us. We can let them change us and renew us. So I'd like to look at Psalm 66, our first scripture reading, with these elements. And I'm actually going to start a little bit earlier than our reading had us, in verse 5. And the psalmist says, "Come and see what God has done. He's awesome in his deeds among mortals." The psalmist is inviting us to listen to this story of how God is working in the community of the people. He's saying, this is a crucial aspect of our history, of our life. This is what God is doing for us. This is a story you have to hear. And then continues on saying, He turned the sea into dry land. They passed through the river on foot. There we've rejoiced in him, who rules by his might forever, whose eyes keep watch on the nations. Let the rebellious not exalt themselves. And so I've chosen this picture of the Red Sea crossing. Imagine the stories that were told about that. The fleeing from Egypt, the pursuit of the enemies, and then we come to this obstacle, this massive expanse of water, and we're terrified because how are we going to get past? I thought God was going to save us. And then the sea opens up, and it's not soggy land or slightly damp, it's completely dry land that they're walking across. This is a miracle. And they're sharing this story. Have you ever been able to walk through the midst of the sea like this? This is what God has done to save us. And the psalmist calls us to a response for what God has done in the community. In verse 8, bless our God, O peoples. Let the sound of his praise be heard, who has kept us among the living and has not let our feet slip. I've invited you to hear my story. I've shared with you. How are you going to respond? And as much as important as community stories are, every now and then I think we wonder, well, what about an individual? I see how God has worked in our community, in our church, in our city. But what about people's individual lives? When we go to personal stories, I feel there's more engagement because we can relate to someone one-on-one instead of one-on community. And we think, how is your story my story? They become more personal for us. And that's what happens in this psalm. The first 12 verses are about the story of the community, but then the last ones are about the psalmist's individual experience. And the same elements are at play here, although in a slightly different order. The psalmist starts out with their response to God, and this can almost serve as an invitation. If we listen to what the psalmist says, he says, I will come into your house with burnt offerings. I will pay you my vows, those that my lips uttered and my mouth promised when I was in trouble. I will offer you burnt offerings of fatlings with the smoke of the sacrifice of rams. I will make an offering of bulls and goats. When you hear someone respond with such joy and praise and dedication of what they want to do for God, what does that make you think of? Do you think, wow, you're so passionate about this. Where did that come from? What happened to you that made you this passionate? I want to know your story. So the psalmist is inviting through their response, this is how excited I am about God and what he has done. And let me share with you my story. He says, come and hear, all you who fear God, and I will tell you what he has done for me. So he's saying, come, listen to this story, because this is how I responded to God, and I want to invite you to know what has happened to me. And the psalmist says, verse 17, I cried aloud to him, and he was extolled with my tongue. If I had cherished iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. But truly, God has listened. He has given heed to the words of my prayer. Blessed be God, because he has not rejected my prayer or removed his steadfast love from me. When I read this part of the psalm, I thought, when have I cried aloud to God? How has God answered my prayers? How have I responded in praise to God for what he has done? Now, recently, I had a really difficult decision to make. You see, I'm graduating really soon, and I received 2 offers for what to do after graduation. I could either continue education at Princeton or work at a hospital. And I was very unsure, so every day I was praying. I'm like, God, please just tell me which one you want me to do. I just want to serve you. Please let me know which one would be more faithful, which one I could be your servant in better, which way I could be more fulfilling of who you want me to be, who you made me to be. And the deadline came, and I had absolutely no answer. And graciously, the places extended the deadline. They're like, okay, you have 2 more weeks, but please give us an answer by then. It's like, okay. Okay, I'm like, God, deadline's coming up again. I really need an answer to this question. And I kept on praying and praying. And at the last moment, the very last day I was allowed to make the decision, I received an answer. Through people, God affirmed which choice I needed to choose. And you all know now that's Princeton. But I was so grateful that God had answered my prayer. I'm like, thank you. And where the psalmist might have a more eloquent way of extolling God, I pretty much was just, thank you, thank you, thank you, you're the best, thank you. I'm not that eloquent when praising, but. So we are invited. The psalmist is inviting us. It's like, how are you praising God for what he has done for you? What have your prayers been? How have they been answered? And in our second scripture reading in Acts, all these same elements are at play. But I want to also start a tiny bit earlier than we did for the lectionary reading. In verse 19, it says, "So they took him," talking about Paul, "and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, 'May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so we would like to know what it means.' Now all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. They're sharing stories. And here they hear this guy named Paul who's telling stories about Jesus, and they're like, all right, come on, we're inviting you. Come tell us your story. We want to hear, because this seems like there's something to it. We want to know, please. We invite you, share your story." And Paul does. Paul comes to them, and he says, "This altar you have to the unknown God. I know that God. That is the God who created the earth, the heavens, everything in it. This is the God who sustains my life. It's the God who sustains your life. It is the God who has done everything. Everything." And he calls them to a response. He says, if this is the God that has done everything, how are you going to respond? Through faith in Jesus is pretty much what he gets at if we look in verse 31. It says, "Because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." He's like, you need to respond to this living God, the sustainer, the creator of everything, our sole purpose for living. This is how we must respond. Every story has an invitation. Every story has the sharing. And every story calls for a response. Have you invited someone to tell their story lately? Have you invited others to hear your story? People out there are waiting. We're wired for stories. We need stories in our lives to help us understand the world and engage. So as we go out, let's share what God has done in our lives. Let's invite people to hear our stories. And all the people of God said, amen.